When my daughter told me I was not invited to Thanksgiving, I laughed quietly, walked to the car, and made a call that would change everything. I promised myself then that there would be consequences. Before I go on, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I sat on the porch with the wind biting my cheeks, the smell of frying turkey floating from a neighbor's house, and the plastic bench cool and familiar under me. Emily looked at me across the kitchen island, her voice clinical and small, and said, "I just do not want you there." That phrase landed like a stone. I felt the texture of the wooden railing under my palms, felt my heart beat loud in my ears, saw the velvet napkins I had bought for their first anniversary where they hung unused. My hands shook. I heard Jason shift his weight behind her and the soft hum of the refrigerator, like the house was breathing with contempt. I remembered every holiday I had paid for, every envelope I had tucked into a drawer, every automatic transfer that had kept their life smooth. I closed my eyes and listened to the night air. I already knew what I would do. She said, "Dad, please do not come." I said, "Are you serious?" She said, "Yes, this is better for all of us." I said, "After everything?" Jason said, "We need space." I said, "Is this because of money?" Emily said, "It is not about money." I said, "It is." Jason said, "Please stop." I said, "You will regret this." Emily said, "You are overreacting." I said, "I am not the one who left money and respect at the door." Jason said, "We are done talking about this." I said, "You will see." The words moved between us like a knife and a wound. The smell of cinnamon and citrus from their candle mixed with the metallic tang of my own saliva. My voice was low and steady, even as my chest tightened, and when I stood to leave, my knees clicked like old wood. Backstory was a slow burn I kept to myself for years. I grew up without many holidays, so I swore I would give mine everything I never had. When Emily was 5, I sold the winter coat I wanted to buy for myself to afford her ballet shoes. I worked double shifts at the hardware store until my back ached and my hands looked like they had stories to tell. At 35, I refinanced and co-signed the mortgage so they could move into a better school district. At 40, I set up automatic transfer of $1,250 per month so the bills would always clear on time. I wrote those transfers in a spreadsheet and labeled them Family Support 2016 through 2023. I kept copies of every bank statement and receipt in a numbered folder, and for a long time pride kept me silent. Then came the losses. A medical scare, 2 summers without work, friends who expected loans and never repaid. Everything I had bled into a home that, in my head, was ours because I had paid so much that I could still name the tile on the kitchen floor. Now that memory sat heavy and raw, a mosaic of all the small sacrifices that had become invisible. In the present, my life smelled of coffee and old paper. I had 6 envelopes of receipts, a fan of yellowed bank statements, and a legal form I had asked Marcus Lee to draft last year when my health made me worry about estate confusion. Marcus had warned me to be careful about access, but he had never imagined I would need those signatures for anything but safety. Marcus Lee called himself a quiet man in a loud town. Linda from 2 doors down helped me collate forms and said, "This is serious, George. If you do this, you will not be able to go back." Robert, the old friend from church, said, "You deserve to be seen." Pastor Angela prayed with me once in the kitchen and told me, "The world will not respect you if you do not respect yourself first." Those 3 voices and more stitched themselves into my courage. The first major scene replayed in my head with the sumptuous clarity of a film. The living room where they had expelled me was warm, the leather couch glossy, the tree lights flickering with a soft golden stutter. Emily set her glass down with a slight clink. I smelled perfume and roasted garlic from the oven. She said, "Dad, just please do not come." I said, "You asked me to sign away my name when you refinanced in 2019. She said, "We had to do that." I said, "Did you ever plan to tell me?" Jason said, "You keep making this about money." I said, "It has always been about money and love." Emily said, "We do not owe you anything." I said, "I paid mortgage payments of $1,250 a month for 7 years, from July 2016 through June 2023. Jason said, "Those were gifts." I said, "Gifts that were automatic transfers from my account signed under my name on a family savings ledger." Emily said, "You are making up numbers." I said, "Here are the bank statements." I set them on the island. The paper was cool and smelled faintly of ink. She looked at the documents as if at a stranger. Her hand trembled, not with anger, but with a sudden, stunned recognition. The sound of the clock was loud. Linda stood in the hallway with a casserole in her arms and watched my daughter read my proof like a stranger reading someone else's mail. That was a moment where the sensorial hit hard. The rustle of pages, the taste of iron fear on my tongue. The light hitting the glossy marble where my fingerprints still lingered, the distant bark of Tommy the neighbor's dog. I recalled all the nights I balanced the checkbook, all the times I skipped dinners so they could have a tutor, and my skin prickled with the heat that was not anger, but the cold realization of betrayal. I spent the next day with a plan that was both clinical and intimate. I called First Harbor Bank and asked to speak to Mr. Reynolds. The line was grainy, the voice of the operator like a distant radio. Mr. Reynolds answered in a tone that suggested he knew my name from years of small-town banking courtesy. "Good morning, Mr. Davis." I said, "I need to place a temporary freeze on transfers to account number 442-891-002, listed under Emily Carter and Jason Reed." He said, "You are not listed on that account." I said, "Listen to me. I have proof that my funds were transferred automatically into that account." He said, "Do you have power of attorney?" I said, "I have a notarized authorization and a legal petition filed with county on November 3rd, and Marcus Lee is on the line." He said, "Hold please." There was a small click and the line held music, smelled of vinyl and fluorescent lighting. Marcus said, "George, remember to stay factual." I said, "I will." We had 8 exchanges total across that call, each line a pebble hitting a pool. Mr. Reynolds asked for folios, dates, amounts. I provided the spreadsheet totals, $1,250 per month times 84 months equals $105,000, with a list of transaction IDs and dates. The bank placed a provisional freeze while compliance investigated. The sensation was immediate, a lightness in my chest, as if air itself had become permission. At 1/3 into the story, there is a moment I want you to join. If you were in my place, what would you do? Take a breath and think about it. Type in the comments, "I would have done," and finish the sentence. It helps to see other points of view. Now back to the narrative. After the freeze, there were provocations that came fast, like birds flying too close to a window. Emily called and left a voice message that vibrated with irony. "Dad, how could you do this? You promised." I called back and asked, "When did you last look at your mortgage papers?" She called me a hypocrite and then hung up. Jason texted a string of resentful sentences and tagged his sister Rebecca and his friend Daniel, who both chimed with opinions. Rebecca said, "You are ruining Thanksgiving for everyone." Daniel wrote, "You are over the top." I felt my phone buzz under my palm with the tactile sting of each message. I read them aloud to myself on the porch with the smell of wet leaves and diesel in the air. The scene at the community center where Emily confronted me later had 8 exchanges between us, each line loaded with accusation, defense, memory, and the sound of cutlery scraping plates in the background. I tasted metal in my mouth and felt my fingernails press into my palm in a loop I could not stop. The investigation phase turned me from hurt man into methodical archivist. I pulled proved documental that included 10 years of bank statements, 3 receipts for home improvements that I had paid in full, a scanned copy of the refinancing agreement dated April 12, 2019, where my signature still appeared in a small clause, and 7 photographs showing me at graduations and birthdays that matched timestamps on social media posts. I organized the material in a red folder with tabs labeled by year. Karen Ortiz from the City Tribune agreed to meet after I reached out with a short email and 2 key documents. Karen had a sharp pen and a reputation for peeling back layers. She said, "If this holds up, I can run it." I said, "Run it with my facts and protect their privacy where you can." She looked at the spreadsheet and said, "This is detailed." The smell of printer toner filled the interview room, the surface of the table cold as resolve. I felt a curious blend of vulnerability and power while Karen typed notes and took photos of the highlighted transactions. I asked her to hold the story until after I confronted them in public. Karen was skeptical and asked why I wanted a public confrontation. I said, because presence matters more than apologies. The confrontation I planned took place at the Reed Carter Charity Gala the family attended every year to maintain social reputation. The hall smelled of chafing oil and polished wood. Chandeliers hummed above guests in velvet and silk. I walked in with a stack of photocopies, a USB with scanned PDFs, and a calm that felt almost unnatural. Emily's face turned a color I had only seen under glass before. I handed copies to Jason, to Emily, to Rebecca, to Daniel, to Linda, who was in the crowd, and to a table where members of the country club sat, including Mayor Collins and publisher Harold Green. I said aloud, "I think you should all see where the money actually came from." The room stilled. The scraping of chairs and murmurs folded into a thin silence. There were at least 8 extended exchanges in this scene. Emily said, "You promised not to make us a story." I said, "You already made a public decision to humiliate me." Rebecca said, "This is so embarrassing." I said, "Embarrassing is hiding the hand that fed you." Jason said, "You are a coward." I said, "I was a father." Mayor Collins leaned in and said, "Are those bank statements?" I said, "Yes, with dates and transaction IDs." Karen stood at my shoulder and said, "The Tribune will verify." Harold Green asked for copies, and his voice tasted like showroom leather. You could hear the clink of ice in glasses as the crowd processed the spreadsheet that showed $105,000 in transfers and specific dates for every deposit. The smell of perfume and the metallic trace of tension filled my nostrils. I saw reputations shift like cards. Faces that had been warm turned cold with a quiet judgment. The proof documental had weight and presence. My name swelled and shrank in the room as people whispered restitution and scandal, and I felt oddly empty and full at once. There were consequences immediate and public. Within 48 hours, the online column by Karen Ortiz posted the spreadsheet visuals and a copy of the selective bank statement redacted to avoid private details. The headline asked, "Who paid the Reeds for years?" Social media lit up. Messages poured in with opinions, some sympathetic, many accusatory. A small creditor's report arrived at Jason's office the next morning. An independent audit from the mortgage company showed discrepancies in payment origin. The association at the country club sent a neutral statement but quietly rescinded an invitation to a weekend retreat. The bank sent a formal notice that the provisional freeze remained until an account review concluded and suggested mediation. Marcus Lee filed a formal complaint and demanded that Emily and Jason account for those automatic transfers. The reputation that had been so carefully curated began to fray. I felt the house go quiet, as if the world had shifted its axis slightly. Readers of the Tribune called my phone with words of encouragement. Linda called to say, "I am proud of you." Robert brought over a bowl of stew and said, "You did the right thing." But not all words were kind. A voicemail from an old friend said, "You went too far." The taste of public unease was bitter. I had 3 moments of tension that rewired me. The first was when Marcus Lee told me in his office that legal fights might cost more than the money I had stopped, and I saw the future of a courtroom stretching ahead like a long, bleak corridor. I felt the thudding heat of worry in my cheeks and the dry tickle at the back of my throat. I had a clear memory of signing papers late one night that would allow this action, and a suspicion that my age would be used against me. The second was during a late night at the bank when a compliance officer named Denise questioned the provenance of transfers and suggested I might have misrepresented myself to gain access. She slid a paper across the desk and said, "This could be fraud." My fingers went numb, and I closed my eyes and tasted the copper of panic. I recalled my mother's voice telling me to keep receipts. The third happened at the Thanksgiving table that I never sat at, when Emily confronted me in front of guests. The quiet hum of 100 judgments washed over me. The heat of shame rose and fell like a tide, and I chose the harder path of exposing truth for the sake of honesty. Each tension was 2 paragraphs long and full of interior debate, memory, and a final decision to act. The community reaction split the town into factions. Some neighbors brought casseroles and quietly said, "You were right to stop the money," and others crossed the street to avoid me. Karen's column was later followed by an editorial from Harold Green's paper criticizing me for public shaming. In response, an accountant friend named Sophia ran numbers and publicly posted a clean breakdown of funds on a local forum that corroborated my totals and argued that a family owed moral accounting as well as financial disclosures. Sophia's spreadsheet became a reference for later discussions. City Council member Denise Park requested a meeting to mediate. I met her in a coffee shop that smelled of burnt beans and legal pads, and she said, "We need closure, not spectacle." I agreed and handed her a sealed folder with copies of the proofs and contact info for Marcus and Karen. 1 month later, things felt smaller. I had spent the money I had stopped transferring on repairs for my own house and a new furnace that chugged with warm, honest breath. The local grocery felt less like a place of judgment and more a space where neighbors nodded. Tommy from down the street brought over his drawings and asked why I had not come to the last picnic. I said I had to choose me for a while. 3 months later, the family's mortgage refinancing hit a snag when auditors requested clear proof of income sources and the lender froze their refinancing until matters cleared. Emily called in tears and asked if we could talk. We met at Linda's kitchen table where the scent of lemon cleaner and fresh bread comforted us. Our conversation lasted 2 hours. There was no fireworks, just small admissions. She said, "We were ashamed and we handled it badly." I said, "I felt invisible until that moment." We talked about the spreadsheet, and she showed me a string of messages from Jason I had never seen, where he had vented about prestige and fear. 6 months later, there was a cautious rebuilding. The town's gossip softened into a background hum, and some friendships matured into something quieter and truer. I was invited to a late afternoon potluck where Emily arrived with a simple pie and Tommy ran to hug me without any marketplace or balance sheet in hand. The epilogue happened in 3 times: 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, and each time there was a concrete change in my life and theirs. I spent a morning teaching Tommy to hammer nails on a small birdhouse and smelled cedar and saw the sunlight warm his hair. I filed for partial restitution, where numbers allowed a mediated refund of $38,000, described in a settlement document that accompanied a public apology Emily read at our small Thanksgiving table. There were receipts attached to a folder and a formal letter of apology sent to the bank and a public statement released in the Tribune. In the end, I learned that sacrifice without recognition can become something corrosive. The humiliation they intended to inflict returned to those who had hidden the truth. My reputation among some neighbors was dented for a time and repaired in ways I did not expect. I got my furnace fixed, some money returned, an official apology, and, more importantly, a new rhythm with my daughter that was honest about boundaries and gratitude. The plan did not rely on revenge alone, but on documentation and process. I kept the spreadsheet and labeled it with the word restitution and a final column with dates. If you are watching and this story touched you, subscribe to see more stories of quiet people who choose to stand up with papers and proof. Share in the comments what you would have done in my place. In the end, I realized dignity cannot be bought and cannot be begged for. You either accept it or you choose to show it to yourself. That was my last thought as the turkey cooled and the house filled with real laughter for the first time in years.